Now, it is my deepest pleasure to welcome our featured speaker for the evening. You can find her full biography within our program, but here are just a few of the highlights. A graduate of Vanderbilt University, Oxford University, and Harvard Law School, Sheryll Cashin is an acclaimed legal scholar and author. She has written multiple books about race relations and inequality in America, such as The Failures of Integration, Place, Not Race, and most recently, Loving, Interracial Intimacy in America and the Threat to White Supremacy. She currently works as a professor of law at Georgetown University, serves as the vice chair of the board at the National Portrait Gallery, and is an active member of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council. She's previously served as an advisor of urban and economic policy to the Clinton White House and was a law clerk to the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall and Judge Abner Mikva in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. Sheryll Cashin has distinguished herself as a thought leader on race relations and as an advocate for civil rights. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished featured speaker, Ms. Sheryll Cashin.
Thank you, Darius. You make that sound so good, so smooth. It's such an honor to be here, to be a principal speaker for you tonight. I want to thank the Fair Housing Justice Center, Fred, Katie, who arranged everything to get me here, and all of you for just coming and frankly giving a damn about this fundamental issue. As Jean pointed out, next year is the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and indeed, the day that law was passed, the Capitol of the United States of America was surrounded by the National Guard. The city was up in flames, as were many cities in this country in the wake of Dr. King's assassination. And that was the context it took to create a bipartisan coalition to support this fundamental idea that it should be illegal to discriminate against someone who's trying to buy a home or rent an apartment. I want to reflect for about 10 minutes on why we need to continue this fight and why we shouldn't give up on the idea that it is possible to have a transformative integration in this country. Racial segregation has been coming down since the passage of the act, although it still remains quite high. It's no secret that African Americans remain the group that all non-black groups have the most temerity about integrating with. And nationally, 6 in 10 African Americans would have to move in order to be evenly distributed throughout the metropolitan areas where they live. That's down from 8 in 10 in 1970, and that's progress. In the 1950s, half of all black people in this country lived in high poverty ghettos. Today, that number is 1 in 6. But as we know, race and class segregation persist in this country. And why is that? As Jean pointed out, in part because discrimination still exists in housing preferences and housing markets, and because of weak anti-discrimination enforcement. It matters who is head of HUD, who is head of the Department of Justice, and who is in the White House, obviously, because of exclusionary zoning in affluent towns that intentionally prevent affordable housing, even market rate apartments, from invading their turf. Because of these and many other practices, it is still possible today for current masters of the universe and other people with choices to insulate themselves from populations they do not want to deal with. And so this has consequences. not just for opportunity, but also for politics. Segregation makes it easier to sell racial dogma about outgroups. It's interesting, almost all of the counties that candidate Donald Trump won had very low percentages of foreign-born immigrants. These were counties where whites were least exposed to non-whites and therefore more likely to be receptive to Trump's tough rhetoric about undocumented immigrants. In other words, those exhibiting the most fear about immigrants were least likely to meet any immigrants. And when you overlay the segregation of people with gerrymandering, it gets even worse. The average Republican lives in a district that looks like America in 1972. Meanwhile, the average Democrat tends to represent a district that looks like the America of 2030. And the end result is a clash of distinctly different worldviews. In a segregated nation where many people and the leaders who represent them get very little practice at pluralism, one could, well, it's clear, democracy is broken. My text said one could argue that democracy is broken. There's obviously segregation also has a terrible consequences for opportunity, particularly for Black and Latino children of color. Only about 30% of Black and Latino families reside in a middle-class neighborhood, just 30%. And meanwhile, 5 decades of social science research tell us what common sense tells us. Even the most motivated child may not be able to overcome unsafe streets, family dysfunction, a lack of mentors and networks that lead to jobs and internships, or just the general feeling of hopelessness that can pervade high poverty places. And the same forces that create geographic disadvantage for many Black and Latino families also disadvantage many struggling white people. In an American metropolis that's stratified into areas of low, medium, and high opportunity, places a disadvantage for anyone who can't afford to buy their way into a premium neighborhood. What happens in a society in which income and wealth are increasingly concentrated in certain places? Bastions of affluence tend to create disadvantage elsewhere, and it leads to what sociologists call opportunity hoarding. And what is that? Opportunity hoarding. In-group sanctioned practices that have the effect of excluding out-groups. In college admissions, legacy preferences is a form of opportunity hoarding. But when it comes to neighborhoods, no one says out loud, hey, let's overinvest in areas that are already advantaged. Let's put the most experienced teachers and the best libraries and public resources here, and let's disinvest elsewhere. Let's put the weakest, uncertified teachers in these concentrated poverty schools where there's so much need. No one says that out loud, but that is exactly what happens when you put affluent people in direct horizontal competition with everyone else for limited public resources. And what can we do about it? Frankly, I don't have much hope about creating class unity among those who are mutually locked out of opportunity, such as the success of dog whistling, divide and conquer politics today. I do, however, feel optimistic about the possibility now and in the future for what I call culturally dexterous whites and people of color to form majority coalitions for sanity in the metropolitan areas where they live and nationally. I think there's some culturally dexterous whites in the room. What is cultural dexterity? I explained it in this new book of mine, Loving. It's the opposite of color blindness. It's the ability to see, be exposed to, be surrounded by people of a different race or ethnicity and accept it and not demand that they assimilate to your culture. Right under our noses. And how do you acquire it? One of the ways you acquire it is through intimate relationships with people of a different race, particularly just friendship. I document rising interracial intimacy across boundaries of, marriage, cohabitation, dating, friendship, and even the kind of what they call parasocial relationships you can develop with a fictional character, or say a black president of the United States. All of these relationships have been shown to reduce prejudice, enhance willingness to engage with other people. In fact, a person with a black friend, it predicts that they are likely to experience anger about what black people experience, and they are likely to be more willing to engage in collective action for racial equality, for racial justice. It was interesting, looking at Charlottesville, a lot of white people in there duking it out, It's like, go for it, we need allies, I'll take it, right? The thing I take hope from is, and optimism is a choice, right? The forces of darkness in this country want you to be beaten down, want you to feel hopeless, want you to stay at home and just accept the status quo, right? You need to have some kind of vision for how it could be better in order to get up every day and keep fighting for it. And I take hope, particularly when I took a lot of time to look at how California changed. California was very similar to where the country is in the late 90s. And in a 20-year period, it went from being majority white to gridlocked to majority minority to functional again in its politics. And no one could win statewide office like Pete Wilson did with the kind of mean-spirited, anti-immigrant, anti-a lot of things politics that ushered Trump into office. And it was the accumulation of a number of forces all at once that made that tipping point possible. Rising interracial intimacy, declines in residential segregation, so people had exposure, the rapid engagement by racial minorities, some of the fastest growing populations in this country, Latinos, Asians, in politics. They experienced discrimination, they didn't like it, and they were motivated to register to vote and to run for office. The dying off of older generations of whites that grew up expecting to be dominant. All of these things had a cumulative impact on the future. And so as I close, I want to leave you with that hope. I think it is possible. I think it's inevitable. We are going to get to a tipping point where a critical mass, not all, but a critical mass of whites in this country accepts the loss of centrality of whiteness and wants to be part of a beautiful coalition of people, again, who want to break things in their areas and create something new that works for everyone, that wants to support the common good. So keep fighting, and we're going to win. Thank you.
And thank you, Sheryll, for agreeing to be part of our celebration this evening, and thank you for your very thoughtful and meaningful remarks. For your outstanding national leadership and years of service in advancing civil rights, and for continuing to help us better understand race relations and the urgent need for all of us to do our part to create more open and inclusive communities, we are pleased to present you with this award for outstanding national contributions to civil rights. Congratulations.